rapporteurs and other mandate holders, as well as important and courageous activists from Sri Lanka. So I welcome everyone, both the panelists and all the guests, and I'm looking forward to roughly an hour and a half of interesting presentations and dialogue. The second half of this event will be dedicated to your questions. So please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, which you're probably all good Zoomers by this point in the pandemic. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You click on that and you can send your questions. Those will be gone through. We'll probably have too many questions to handle, but they will be carefully selected and we'll try to give a good representative sample of the different opinions and questions coming in. So I would like to thank all the panelists in particular, some dialing in and zooming in from Sri Lanka. Hopefully the connections, including my own connection in London, will hold up. Not guaranteed, I warn you. So I'd like to get us started, unless someone tells me I'm forgetting something. So I'd like to pass on the baton to the Special Rapporteur on the rights of freedom of assembly and association, Clément Voul, who is one among the members who has been to Sri Lanka and reported on Sri Lanka and has a lot to say. So thank you all, and I'll be popping in and out and sort of directing traffic as we go along. Okay, over to you, Clément.
Thank you, Alan. Estimated colleagues and friends, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are joining us from. Good afternoon or good morning also for those who are joining us from far, but on this online platform. It is an honor to welcome you all to this event in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. I'm encouraged by the enthusiasm and commitment that you all, including our moderator, Alan, have demonstrated in the lead up to this Human Rights Council session, generally, and more specifically in the lead up of these events. Let me start by paying tribute to the testimonies that we will hear during these events. These are not alone, but an illustration of the hundreds of silent voices that will still cry out for justice to redress the human rights violation and abuses that they and their loved ones suffer from in the beautiful land, which is Sri Lanka. This is primarily dedicated to them and meant to give them the space that they deserve as the Human Rights Council discuss the important issue of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. I'm also humbled by the great wealth of expertise around this screen today, starting from my fellow Special Rapporteur, whom I thank for their tireless work over the years to support Sri Lanka in fulfillment of its human rights obligation. I was one of the latest UN Special Rapporteur who conducted a visit to Sri Lanka back in July 2019. And back then, I had observed early warning sign of rollbacks on hard-fought progress made in the previous 4 to 5 years on rebuilding democratic institutions, pressing for accountability for past crimes, delivering justice for victims, and promoting reconciliation between communities. Regrettably, more than a year and a half later, I and my other colleagues who had visited Sri Lanka between 2015 and 2019, thanks to the cooperation of the governments, had to accept that the rollback have become a live reality. We, the UN Special Rapporteur, look back at some 400 recommendations made following 10 official visits from 2015 to 2019, and which identify root causes, patterns, and complexities relating to a history of conflict, human rights violation and abuses, and impunity, a considerable investment both from the side of the government and the UN special procedures. And we were dismayed to realize the extent of the emerging trends setting back the promotion of reconciliation, accountability, and human rights, reducing civic space and eroding important institutional safeguard for the protection of human rights. Our assessment zero in some specific thematic area that in our view remain particularly problematic, namely threats to the independent institution and the rule of law, increasing militarization, restriction on freedom of peaceful assembly, association and expression, discrimination against vulnerable groups, incitement to hate and violence against minority, legal safeguards, condition of detention and prohibition of torture, enforced disappearances, impunity, and lack of progress in the transitional justice process. We will delve a bit more in some of these areas during our today conversation. And so without further delay, I'm turning back to the moderator and hope that the discussion will be fruitful for the way forward. And I hope that you will hear from this discussion testimony from people that will share their suffering, the people that will share so many years of injustice. And I hope that from here, we will send a very important and very target sign to the Human Rights Council that the resolution that Council is planning to adopt will address the victim concern and their need. I thank you very much and hope that you will we will have a fruitful discussion here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I still seem to have connection. I lost it briefly, but I'm back, so that's good. Thank you for your remarks, your opening remarks, Monsieur Voul. Now we have 3 testimonials from Sri Lanka, from activists well known among many of us and among many Sri Lankans. The first will be by video, and it's from Sandhya Eknalagoda, who is a Sri Lankan human rights activist. She became an International Woman of Courage, or she won the International Woman of Courage Award in 2017, well-deserved. She's been campaigning for thousands of missing persons in Sri Lanka, including her own husband, the missing journalist and cartoonist, Pragit Eknalagoda, whose case has been very prominent in Sri Lanka. It's one of the many emblematic cases that has not yet been solved, unfortunately. Because she's a member of Sri Lanka's majority Sinhalese community, she will speak in Sinhala, and which hopefully the video will, I believe it has English subtitles, so we'll all be able to understand it. And I will pass you over now to Flora, who will press the right buttons and we'll see what Sandhya has to tell us.
We were having small problems with the video, so I will be sharing it, but it shouldn't be a problem. I will just share it from my screen. Please give me a second.
Okay.
Can you see the video?
Here we go.
Okay, there seems to be a small issue, so I would suggest that we move on to the two speakers first, and we will listen to the video in a moment. My apologies for that.
Okay. Hopefully we can get it sorted out. Okay. All right, our next speaker is Simit Kudsan Sandralila, also quite a well-known activist based in the northern province of Sri Lanka. Also like Sandhya, but in a different way, affected by the armed conflict. And she's been battling during the last several years for land rights, as well as issues around disappearances. She will speak about civic space. And unfortunately, I believe the lack of active or the decline in civic space and democratic space that we're seeing right now in Sri Lanka. So over to you, Ms. Sandralila. Okay. Okay, we're just getting a message that she's not able to dial in, I guess. So, okay, 2 for 2. Let's see, let's try, I guess, hopefully we will have some luck connecting, getting the video working and connecting back to Sandrulila soon. We can always hope. So I guess it's over to you, Ambika. Ambika Satkunanathan is currently a fellow with the Open Society Foundations. From 2015 to 2020, she was a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka, did a lot of excellent work and took on the government in very brave and smart ways. And prior to that, she was for 8 years, she was a legal consultant with OHCHR, helping OHCHR figure out what's going on in Sri Lanka. So I look forward to what Ambika has to tell us. Over to you.
Thank you, Alan. I think what we see in Sri Lanka now is a form of law and order whereby the law becomes a state weapon of choice to control dissent. But at the same time, little respect is shown for the rule of law. We also see an unchecked national security regime that functions on creating fear amongst the public to obtain support for restricting fundamental rights. The executive president plays a key role in this because it is the executive's extended use of emergency powers to legislate that allows him to bypass elected representatives for an extended period of time that led to the state of exception remaining even after the state of emergency ceased to exist. What is happening now is part of a continuum that I suppose it's reaching its peak. During the first Rajapaksa regime, when the state of emergency lapsed in August 2011, the president used Section 12 of the Public Security Ordinance to call out the army to maintain law and order for many years. Like President Mahinda Rajapaksa, President Sirisena too used Section 12 after the state of emergency that was imposed following the Easter attacks was lifted in August 2019. Similarly, as soon as he was elected, the President Gotabaya began using Section 12 as well, with the most recent order issued on 17th February 2021. So a common strategy that is part of this national security regime is to label those calling for accountability and dissenters as threats to national security, which is then used to legitimize and justify extraordinary measures taken by the state against that person, often through weaponizing the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So now you would have the Tamil diaspora or the NGOs could be portrayed as an ever-present threat to the country. Foreign Secretary Admiral Jayantha Columbaga's statement that once you are a terrorist, you're always a terrorist, that is what we believe in, illustrates how dangerous being labeled a terrorist can be. Being a minority makes a person especially vulnerable to being so labeled. For example, the headline of an article on state-run ITN News website after the protest against the demolition of the memorial at the Jaffna University says, students who are going to be terrorists kneel before the special task force. Following the historical pattern of arbitrary arrests of Tamils under the PTA, after the Easter attacks, we saw the arrest of scores of Muslims, seemingly without evidence or reasonable suspicion. For example, there were cases of men being arrested for possessing small amounts of chlorines or even documents or the Quran in Arabic. More recently, poet Aunaf Jassim from Mana in the north, was arrested in May 2020 because of a book of poetry, which supposedly promotes extremism, but actually calls for an end to extremism and is anti-violence. So what is the pattern that has emerged about the way PTA has been used? Many prisoners who we interviewed as part of the Human Rights Commission's National Study of Prisons said that they were abducted from their homes, workplaces, or while traveling, and that their families were not provided an arrest receipt or information on their place of detention. They reported they were subjected to torture during the period that they were held on detention orders following their arrest. Of the study sample, 84% of male PTA inmates stated they suffered torture following arrest, and also that an overwhelming majority of them were made to sign confessions, 83% of them. And 95% of them said that the confession was written in Sinhala, a language they did not understand, and it was not explained to them. We see that after the Easter attacks too, there were people who complained to the Human Rights Commission of coercion being used to make them sign confessions. Some PTA prisoners were also taken out of prison while in remand custody and held at unauthorized and authorized places of detention. The PTA actually allows for this. And during this time, they were subject to physical ill treatment. The Commission also learned that the longest period a person had been on remand without being indicted was 15 years. The longest period a trial had been ongoing was 16 years. 41 persons were appealing their sentences under the PTA, with the longest period a person had been awaiting a decision, 14 years, as of September 2018. The Commission was also notified of individuals who have spent up to 13 to 15 years on remand, with one particular prisoner stating he received a 3-year sentence after serving 13 years in remand. Many of the issues related to arbitrary arrest and detention and torture are systemic and deep-rooted, as illustrated by the 483 complaints of torture and 462 complaints of arbitrary arrest and detention, and the 400 complaints of torture and 775 complaints of arbitrary arrest and detention received by the Human Rights Commission in 2018 and 19 respectively, illustrating the worrying pattern of using and abusing anti-terror law to erode human rights. I have been informed that the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into the Easter attacks states that the report that was recently released, that it states that law enforcement authorities will be prevented from effectively carrying out their investigations if counter-terrorism law is drafted with more emphasis to safeguard the human rights of terror suspects. The report also reportedly says that the CTA will not act as a deterrent to terrorists because it is not provided for the death penalty, and recommends that detention orders be issued for 6 months and be extendable up to 2 years. It also reportedly says that this must be combined with a rehabilitation process for the terror suspect. So, despite all the evidence that I have even presented to you, historically, the state has been averse and hostile to holding any state official accountable for rights violations, even for violations that are not conflict related. In that context, urgent, meaningful, and substantive action is needed to halt rollbacks on human rights and ensure accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambika. I think your point about the deep-rooted nature of the institutionalized impunity and sort of tolerance of violation of rights in the name of security is absolutely central to a lot of what we're talking about today. So we will now hopefully get the video working for Sandhya Eknalagoda's presentation. I think she certainly is a living example of the struggles against impunity in Sri Lanka. So hopefully we will hear her Sinhala words with English subtitles.
මම 2010 දී ආරම්භ කරපු ප්‍රගීත් සොයා ගැනීමේ ගමන මේ 2020 වෙනකොට නඩු දෙකක් බවට පත් වෙලා තිනවා. ඒ 2019 දී අපරාධ පරීක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව හොයාගත්ත තොරතුරු අනුව නීතිපති විසින් නඩු දෙකක් ගොනු කරලා තියෙනවා. පළවෙනි එක 2009 දී ප්‍රගීත් පළවෙනි වතාවට පැහැරගෙන යාම සම්බන්ධව සහ දෙවැනි එක 2010 දී ප්‍රගීත් පැහැරගෙන ගොස් අතුරුදහන් කිරීම සම්බන්ධව මේ දෙකටම ඉන්නේ එකම නිලධාරීන් තමයි මේ දෙකම කරලා තියෙන්නේ. ඒත් මේ වෙනකොට මේ වර්තමාන ආණ්ඩුව ජනාධිපතිපත් වුණාට පස්සේ ඒවට ඉතා නරක කල දසාවක් තමයි පත් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. මක්නිසාදියත් ජනාධිපතිපත් කරපු මේ කොමිසමක් විසින් දේශපාලන පරිගැනීම් කොමිසම විසින් මේ වෙනකොට කියලා තියෙනවා මේ හමුදා නිලධාරීන් මේකට කිසිම සම්බන්ධයක් නැහැ කියලා. සහ මේ වෙනකොට ඒ පරීක්ෂණ කරපු අපරාධ පරීක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ නිලධාරීන් බන්ධනාගාරගත කළා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ යුක්තිය සෙවීමේ අරගලය කුමක් සඳහා තව දුරටත් අපි දිගට ගෙන යන්න පුළුවන් වේවිද? ඒ වගේම මේ අධිකරණයේ විසින් අපරාධකාරයන් ලෙස නම් කරලා බන්ධනාගාරගත කරපු මිරිසුලින් රත්නායකට ජනාධිපති සමාව දෙනවා. ඉතින් ලංකාව තුල තියෙන මේ දණ්ඩ මුක්තිය නිසා මේ හමුදා නිලධාරීන්ට දඬුවම් දීලා අපිට යුක්තිය සොයා ගැනීම ඉතාම දුෂ්කර වෙලා තියෙනවා. උතුරේ අම්මලාත් මේ අරගලේම තාමත් ඉන්නේ. ඉතින් ලංකාවේ දණ්ඩ මුක්තිය අවසන් වෙන්නේ කවදාද? ඒක සඳහා ඔබලාගේ මැදිහත් වීම අත්‍යවශ්‍යම දෙයක් වෙනවා. මක් නිසාදයත් අපිට යුක්තිය සත්‍ය ඊටාම වැදගත් දෙයක් වන නිසා.
Okay, well, I can't thank Sandhya, but we can all appreciate her power of her words. And now for two reflections on what we've heard so far and also on what they've learned through their prior engagement on Sri Lanka. We were going to hear remarks from the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Ms. Lee Toomey, and then we'll hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Mr. Fernand de Varenne. So first to Ms. Toomey.
Thank you very much. And may I start by really thanking the organisers for, including Clermont Voulet and others at OHCHR, the colleagues working to support all the mandates, for organising this side event. It's really important and could not be a more timely event such as now. As was mentioned, my name is Lee Toomey. I'm the chair of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. The working group visited Sri Lanka in December 2017, so it's coming up to about 3 years now since we've been there. Hopefully, much of what I'm about to say is very much still current. It certainly reflects the information that we continue to receive from those on the ground. We also met coincidentally with Ambika while we were in country, actually, and I heard what she had said about the number of people on remand under the PTA and could not support that more strongly. We also came across a very large number of people on remand for very long periods, well beyond the standards envisaged in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. For example, in our report, which you can find on our website, you'll see mentioned that we came across one individual who had been under pretrial detention under the PTA for 22 years, which is completely unacceptable. And while it was one individual, we also came across many of the cases that Ambika outlined, including people on remand for 10 to 15 years, which is well and truly excessive. I wanted to talk to you a little bit tonight. Tonight, my time, I'm in Brisbane, Australia, so broadcasting to you from the other side of the world. But I wanted to talk to you really in a spirit of cooperation. I think what the special procedures mandate holders are hoping to get out of this event is really to put the emphasis at this timely moment upon the government of Sri Lanka implementing all of our recommendations. And it's in that spirit, as well as the spirit of prevention, in terms of trying to help the country not go back to where it was, that I wanted to draw attention to the working group's recommendations. I mentioned these under the general category of legal safeguards, conditions of detention, and prohibition of torture. Now, as you might expect from what I've just said, a major point of inquiry for the working group while it was in Sri Lanka was to look at the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We looked very closely at the Act, including what many stakeholders told us, and we were informed that it either because of the wording or because of its implementation, is resulting not only in the very long periods of pretrial detention that I referred to, but that people can't access legal assistance until the commencement of proceedings, and that also bail is the attorney Attorney General can routinely deny bail, which is often the case for PTA suspects. So we recommended that it be repealed and promptly replaced with new counter-terrorism legislation in line with international best practices, and to ensure that safeguards against arbitrary arrest and detention and torture and other cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment are prevented wherever possible. That was, I think, one of the centerpieces of our recommendations. We really heard a significant amount in traveling around the country about the PTA. I understand from our sources on the ground, from follow-up to our country visit, that there has been no progress in repealing or amending the PTA, and that's one of the key recommendations that we would like to see implemented going forward. I see that the High Commissioner also mentions this topic in her recent report. The next recommendation that we made, and it's closely related to the first one, was that an urgent nationwide audit be conducted to determine exactly how many people are being held under the PTA. We received at various points different numbers. It was good to hear Ambika refer to definite numbers. We received numerous conflicting accounts, but what was very clear was that the numbers were large and continue to be. So we recommended that an audit be conducted to determine how long people have been deprived of liberty, their status, their location, to really address the numerous human rights violations and due process violations that they had experienced. We felt that an audit would be the best way of doing that and really determining what the amount and nature of the human rights violations were. Thirdly, we determined that past and present allegations of torture and ill treatment must be investigated, and those responsible are, of course, prosecuted and punished. Now, torture, it isn't immediately obvious how torture is relevant to the working group's mandate, but let me explain very briefly. Of course, there's a special rapporteur on torture, but the working group looks closely at instances of reported torture in terms of the impact that it can have on fair trial and whether detention is therefore arbitrary, in terms of both forced confession and whether torture makes the conditions of detention so impossible that a person's not able to effectively present their own defense. So that's how torture is relevant to our mandate. And we recommended that directives, among others, be provided to the security sector, particularly the police, that all officers are given very clear and unequivocal instructions that all acts of torture are forbidden and punished and will be punished and investigated. In a related recommendation, number 4, we also came across many instances, and I'm sure this is still the case, of confessions having been obtained under duress and without consent. And we really spoke to a number of people about what would be the most effective way of dealing with that massive problem. And many mentioned the real need to bring PTA and other suspects who, it should be remembered that not only PTA, but other criminal suspects were forced to give confessions in the accounts that we heard, and that those people really need to be brought before a judge. Confession should not be made in the absence of a lawyer and really need to be made before a judge who needs to ascertain that they were made freely and without coercion. We received information while in Sri Lanka that under the PTA, the voir dire process effectively reverses the burden of proof, so that the prosecution only has to prove to the balance of probabilities that a confession was given freely, and then the onus converts to the defendant to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the confession was not given freely, which is very hard to prove in many cases when someone's been in lengthy pretrial detention and doesn't always have access to legal counsel and to the relevant documents. And finally, the working group during its visit in December 2017 paid particular attention to the conditions of detention. We visited a number of places of detention with a particular focus on criminal law, but also more broadly than those. We visited Navy camps and other places that had been reported to us as possible previous and current sites of torture and ill treatment. And we wanted to emphasize, and I emphasize today in this important side event, the importance of reducing overcrowding by overhauling the prison system. We found that many people were simply on remand because they weren't being brought before the courts regularly. The procedures didn't exist. There weren't enough prosecutors or judges to do so. And that was significantly contributing to overcrowding. And we recommended that the authorities look very closely at implementing the Mandela rules and the Bangkok rules in the case of female detainees. So I know that I only have 5 minutes to speak, and I think I've probably covered that, but those were the main recommendations that the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention made that I wanted to draw to your attention. I also have some ideas which I'd be happy to discuss during the Q&A about how we can follow up on those recommendations and what's currently preventing that from being done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'd love to hear your thoughts on how to get beyond simply making recommendations, which we know, unfortunately, as your joint statement has made clear, are not actually implemented with a few tiny exceptions. I have the good news, which is that Ms. Sandra Lila has been able to join us, so we will go back a step in the order, but I'm sure it will be actually a step forward. So over to you, Sandra Lila. We're looking forward to what you have to tell us. I see that she's on there somewhere, but I think you're muted. Okay, hopefully there's some.
The translation is given to me.
Uh-huh.
I'm Mansoor.
Oh, okay, good.
That thing, all right, okay.
2010 இலங்கை ஜனாதிபதியின் ஆட்சியின் உரிமை சார்ந்த போராட்டங்களை செய்வதற்கும் நினைவுகூறல்கள் செய்வதற்கும் இராணுவமும் இராணுவ புலனாய்வும் தொடர்ச்சியான அச்சுறுத்தல்களையும் அடக்குமுறைகளையும் பிறப்பித்தது.
That is during the 2010 period, under the then president, military and military intelligence officers continuously threatened and oppressed those who fought for their rights and who were involved in activities related to remembering the dead.
அதன் பின்னர் தொடர்ந்து வந்த ஆட்சியில் எமது உரிமைகளும் புறக்கணிக்கப்பட்டு முடக்கப்பட்டாலும் இருந்தும் எமது உறவுகளை நினைவு கூறுவதற்கு சந்தர்ப்பங்களும் மற்றும் உரிமை சார்ந்த போராட்டங்கள் செய்யக்கூடியதற்கு சந்தர்ப்பங்களும் கிடைக்கப்பெற்றது. இருந்தும் எனக்கு என்னை போன்ற சக மனித உரிமை செயற்பாட்டாளர்களை நீதிமன்றங்களில் எமது உரிமை குரலை முடக்கும் வகையில் வழக்கு தாக்கல்கள் செய்யப்பட்டது.
During the rule of the next government, although our rights were undermined, we had opportunities to remember our dead and carry out struggles for our rights. However, cases were filed against me and other human rights defenders so as to cripple our rights.
இவ்வாறு இருக்கையில் தற்போதைய ஆட்சியில் பாடசாலை உட்பட மக்களின் அனைத்து செயற்பாடுகளில் இராணுவ அச்சுறுத்தலும் ஆக்கிரமிப்பும் காணப்படுகிறது.
Under the present government, there is heavy military presence in all public affairs, including at schools. People face threats from the military.
அத்துடன் சோதனை சாவடிகளில் இளைஞர்களை மறைத்து அப்பட்டமான பொய் காரணங்களை காட்டி அடித்தும் மிரட்டியும் வருகின்றார்கள்.
At checkpoints, our youth are subjected to threats and assaults for silly reasons.
மீள்குடியேற்றம் செய்யப்பட்டு 12 வருடங்களாகியும் முல்லைத்தீவு கேப்பாப்புலவு மக்களின் காணிகள் விடுதலை செய்யாமை காரணமாக அவர்களின் கால்நடைகள் அக்காணிக்குள் சென்றால் உரிமையாளர்களை கைது செய்கின்றார்கள்.
People of Keppapulavu in Mullaitivu district resettled here almost 12 years ago. Since their lands have not been released so far, they cannot take their cattle into such properties. If they take them, the owner is arrested.
உரிமைக்காக குரல் கொடுக்கும் நீதி நியாயங்களை கேட்கும் முதியவர்கள் முதல் சிறுவர்களாக இருந்தாலும் அவர்களை தீவிரவாதிகளுடைய தொடர்புகள் என்றும் சட்டவிரோதமான செயற்பாடுகளில் ஈடுபடுகின்றார்கள் என்றும் குற்றம் சாட்டி கண்டிக்கப்படுகின்றார்கள்.
Persons who raise their voice for their rights and point out injustices, irrespective of their age, they are branded as persons who maintain links with the extremists and who engaged in illegal activities.
முன்னாள் போராளிகளை மீண்டும் மீண்டும் விசாரணைக்கு அழைக்கப்படுகின்றார்கள்.
Ex-combatants are repeatedly taken for questioning.
6 மாதங்கள் ஆகியும் பயங்கரவாத தடை சட்டத்தின் கீழ் கைது செய்யப்பட்டவர்களை பார்வையிட முடியவில்லை.
Persons who have been arrested under the PTA, even after 6 months, we could not see them.
தற்போதைய நிலையை கொரோனா வைரஸை காரணம் காட்டி தமிழ் பேசும் மக்களின் கலை கலாச்சார நினைவு கூறல்களை முடக்கும் முகமாவது, அதாவது மாவீரர் நாள், இன ஒழிப்பு நாள், பொத்திவில் தொடக்கம் பொலிகண்டி வரையிலான போராட்டத்தில் கலந்து கொள்ளக்கூடாதென அதில் ஆர்வம் காட்டியவர்கள் மீது எம்மில் சிலரை நீதிமன்ற தடை உத்தரவும் பிறப்பிக்கப்பட்டு விசாரணைகளும் இடம்பெற்று வருகின்றது.
Under the pretext of fighting COVID-19, activities related to the arts and culture of the Tamil-speaking people are being suppressed. Court orders have been issued against few of us who are so keen in participating Heroes Day, Genocide Day, and the protest march from Pothuvil to Puligandi. Inquiries also have been held against us.
இவ்வாறு எமது உரிமைகள் முடக்கப்படுவதுடன் இன ஒழிப்பு நடவடிக்கையும் இடம்பெறுவதை காணக்கூடியதாக இருக்கின்றது.
It can be observed that our rights are being suppressed through such interventions, while Tamils are being targeted for atrocities based on their ethnicity.
நன்றி.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you, Mansoor and Sandra Leela. I'm struck by just how perennial these problems of land and militarization and this repression of dissent, how interconnected and long-lasting they are. Let's go now for some comments from the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Fernand de Varenne.
Merci beaucoup, distingués collègues, mesdames et messieurs. Bonjour Clément, bonjour tout le monde. Almost 5 years ago, my predecessor held a mission to Sri Lanka, and what she saw then was exclusionary and discriminatory practices, specifically against certain minorities. Unfortunately, plus ça change, plus c'est pareil. Changes in more recent years have not been, let's be honest, for the better. Minorities remain stigmatized. We've already heard this. They're stigmatized as threats, sometimes terrorists, disloyal, or not real citizens deserving of full equality because they're different. They're different because of their culture, religion, or language. She highlighted in particular the very low levels of participation and representation of minorities in the major institutions and decision-making bodies. This is also often apparent because of the dominance of the Sinhala language. We just heard about that, as a matter of fact, and the de facto sole language in these institutions and bodies. That has the result of excluding particularly Tamils and others who may not be fluent in that language. And to be more direct, minorities and in particular Tamils and Muslims are vastly underrepresented in these areas, including in employment in the civil service. This raises grave concerns of discrimination. This is a potential violation of one of the most fundamental human rights pillars in international law. She also identified barriers such as not being able to use the Tamil language when dealing with state institutions, local authorities, the police, and even public hospitals, for example. She was told that most of these institutions across the country use only Sinhala in communications. So this language gap often puts Tamil speakers, including, by the way, most Muslims, at a significant disadvantage with respect to employment and access to various service. And indeed, what is surprising is that while in 2010, the government seemed to initiate a few steps, a few good practices in this regard with the creation of the Ministry of National Languages and Social integration that then became, in 2015, the Ministry of National Coexistence, Dialogue, and Official Languages. All of those ministries and what we could have actually assumed were steps towards good practices were abolished after 2018. There was also a Ministry for Resettlement, Rehabilitation, Northern Development, and Hindu Religious Affairs. That's also gone after 2018. So the signal for minorities is that their interests and their rights do not seem to matter in the structures of government in Sri Lanka from particularly 2019. The conclusion seems to be fairly evident. And what could have been considered as I said earlier, as steps towards good practices have been really eliminated in the last couple of years. So this clearly suggests, it seems, active hostility and discriminatory practices towards minorities and their exclusion from full participation in society. Another issue, and I will have to finish soon, another issue is that law enforcement officers and members of the military are almost exclusively Sinhalese. And those who are deployed in Tamil-speaking areas often lack Tamil language skills. And this causes real problems, day-to-day problems and frustrations. But it also widens the gap further between majority and minority communities. One example I think it's important to mention is that despite the establishment of a children and women's bureau desks, or a series of desks at local police stations, minority women, particularly Tamils and Muslims, reported difficulties in access owing to language barriers. And to my knowledge, there are no noticeable improvement in these matters, nor efforts to address these examples of exclusion and probably discrimination. There's difficulties in constructing new places of worship and even accessing cemeteries, especially for members of smaller Christian and Muslim denominations. Moreover, it seems that Article 9 of the Constitution, which refers to the status of Buddhism, is used sometimes to the detriment of other religions. We've noticed there's been reports of accelerated construction of Buddhist temples, shrines, and statues in what is described as an alarming rate and in areas that were traditionally non-Buddhist. And this creates resentment and animosity. So for several years now, my mandate has been monitoring with concern the reports also of attacks by extremists, Buddhist extremists, most notably involving groups such as the Budu Pala Sena, which incite violence and actually hatred against religious and other minorities while proclaiming the superiority of Sinhala Buddhists. Even after death, you will have heard, and a number of colleagues have issued a communication in this regard, you will have heard that the burials of Muslims were not permitted recently. Under the false claim, cremation was necessary to avoid the spreading of the COVID virus. It seems, however, that this policy has been changed, but it shows a dismissal, if not disdain, for the rights of minorities, even after the end of their life. And finally, I have reports of current legislation being used against human rights defenders and government critics, including individuals such as Ramzi Razik, who was arrested, detained, and apparently mistreated in detention because on Facebook, he posted a call for action against organized anti-Muslim hate speech in social media. If I can end by saying, I am extremely concerned that since the visit of my predecessor, things have gone from, well, I think the best way to describe it is from bad to worse. And the human rights of minorities are clearly not respected and implemented as they should in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think